there is no alternative to a two-state solution in this generation. I think most of them intellectually would move to a one-state solution, because that is the only moral option they can be comfortable with if they don't have a two-state solution. In practice, it is highly unlikely that the Israelis would accept that. And that is why when I ask even the broader Arab public opinion, what do you believe would happen if the two-state solution prospect collapses? The vast majority believe that we would have protracted conflict for years to come. Only about 9% believe there would be a one state. Only about 7% believe that Palestinians would ever surrender. And I think they're right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shibley. Harry Zick is the director and founder of the Gulf 2000 project. He served in the National Security Council under 3 presidents. He was the point man during the Iranian hostage crisis in 1980. He is a graduate of Columbia University with a PhD, where he is a senior research fellow. Harry?
Well, it's always a pleasure to appear on the same panel with Shibley, who's been a good friend for many years, and we've worked together at the Human Rights Watch, where I had the great pleasure that he replaced me as the head of a committee for the Advocacy Committee for Human Rights Watch Middle East. And it was to the benefit of everybody, me, the committee, and everybody except Shibley. He lost out. I am going to talk to you during this limited period of time, looking at Iran in particular, about the knowns and the unknowns. One of the great contributions that Shibley has made to this entire field is, in fact, increasing the area of what we know and decreasing the area of what we don't know. And I think those polls that he runs, especially as you get serial data over a long period of time, really tell us a great deal about what's going on in the region. Not just ideology, not just the viewpoints of one person or another, not just the political agenda, but what is actually happening on the ground. And I think that's where you have to start. So what I'm going to do is, Iran is, as some of you here are extremely well aware, because we have some people here who spend a lot of time dealing with Iran on the ground in a variety of interesting ways. Iran is, even to those who study it all the time, something of an enigma. It is to the Iranians themselves, actually. And that is, in fact, what makes it interesting. In the old days, Saddam's government was not interesting. Basically, it all involved the way he felt when he got out of bed that morning, and that was sort of it. That's all you needed to know about the politics. In Iran, it's just the reverse, that you never know what's going to happen next, and there's no individual who is in charge. But that is what makes it an interesting study for those of us who spend a lot of time doing it. Obviously, the unknowns in the equation are more interesting, almost by definition, than the knowns. So I'm going to work my way up to those. I'm going to start with the things that I think we know, more or less, of which you may not have thought about, and move toward the areas of what we don't know so well. I'm going to start with the geopolitical situation. Although this group here and this whole operation is focused very much on the Arab-Israel dispute, I think it's important for you to keep in mind that some very interesting things have happened over the past, say, 20, 25 years, certainly the last 17 years since Desert Storm and the United States intervened very dramatically in the Persian Gulf, is that, in my view, the center of gravity of Middle East politics has been shifting from the Arab-Israel side toward the Persian Gulf. And I think you need to keep that in mind, that it used to be accepted that the Arab Israel dispute was it. That was what U.S. policy in the Middle East really was about, and everything hinged on that. That's still true to a very considerable degree, that you're not going to have a coherent, workable policy for the United States in the Middle East unless you manage to make some progress on the Arab-Israel dispute. But the game isn't over with just the Arab-Israel dispute. That is a contributing factor now to other things. And one of the things that I think a lot of people don't think about is that over that 17 years since Desert Storm, the United States has itself become a Middle East power. We are a Middle East power. We have the largest footprint economically, politically, militarily in the Middle East, bigger than almost any government there. And we've been there for a long time now, a generation. And I think we still have not absorbed the fact that we are a Middle East power and that we have to think about our role in that way. The other thing that I think we have to recognize is that Iran is in fact emerging as a major power, a pole of influence in the region. And I would argue that Iran is the counterpart to Israel in the west, that you've got Iran on the east, that is emerging as the two regional powers. And just as Shibley was talking about the fact that isn't it surprising that none of these are Sunni Arabs who attract attention? Isn't it odd that you would have two emergent powers in the Middle East, neither one of which is Sunni, neither one of which is Arab, and actually neither one of which even speaks Arabic? It is an interesting aspect of the Middle East that we don't think about very much. And finally, on that aspect of it, when we're talking about U.S. policy in the region and even this emergence of Iran, we really have to stop and recognize that we did this ourselves. Just as Shibley was talking about policies that we attempted for one reason or another, which failed or backfired on us, I think we have to see our situation in the Persian Gulf and our situation with Iran as an example. After 9/11, we went into Afghanistan and overthrew the Taliban and scattered it to the winds. The Taliban happened to be Iran's worst enemy to the east. We then turned around even before we completed that process and invaded Iraq, overthrowing Saddam Hussein, which was Iran's worst enemy to the west, and a government that had fought a war with them for 8 years. And then we discovered that Iran is suddenly emerging as a more powerful state. I raised this at one point with a senior American diplomat and said, you know, after he was complaining about all the terrible things that Iran was doing, I said, you know, didn't we have something to do with that? And his answer, he stopped for a second and said, well, we didn't mean to. And we didn't. But there we are. And I think what we've done in the last few years is attempt then, it's kind of a political jujitsu, that you take your weakness and turn it into a strength. That you say, okay, we've created this 800-pound gorilla in the Gulf, which we call Iran, and now, having done that, let's organize a coalition and all get together to oppose Iran as the primary enemy in the region, and then that will give us the basis for some kind of a policy where we all work together. And it was also premised on the idea that Iran, the threat from Iran, would be so great that it would get the Arabs and even the Arabs and Israelis to collaborate with one another. Maybe not a coalition, maybe not a formal agreement, but that they would cooperate because they both shared this view. Well, to some degree, they do share this view, but I think, again, the Shibley's numbers show they don't share it in the sense that they're prepared to change their entire national strategy in order to deal with it. And the policy basically didn't work. That our attempt to put together this counter coalition against Iran And we offered, $75 billion in arms sales and military assistance to these governments to work out an agreement. And they were happy with that, and they accepted it. But they would not then go on and fulfill their part of the bargain, as we saw it from our point of view. Well, these are the things that I think we know. I'm going to, let me talk very briefly, I am going to be brief about Iran's nuclear issues, because this, I think, as the NIE would put it, is an area where we have moderate confidence, as opposed to the sort of beginning part of the overview. And I'll just let me make a few comments which may be provocative, but which I think are true, and if you wish to follow up and challenge me on it, I would welcome that, actually. First of all, Iran's progress on the nuclear file has actually been quite slow. If you look at most other countries that have covertly built a nuclear weapon, took a decision to do that, and then went about doing it, it took them about 5 or 6 years from the time they made their decision until they had some kind of a workable device. Iran made its decision to go for a nuclear program about 1985, maybe a little bit later than that. You can argue about the dates, but the reality is it was 22 years ago, or 20 years ago anyway. And what have they got? At this point, they've got at least 3,000 rather poorly operating centrifuges sitting in a huge hall in Natanz, which we are, I think, rightly upset about. And they've got another centrifuge that they're working on. But I think the NIE makes it pretty clear that even if they were thinking about going for a bomb at any point, they have decided at least to put that on hold for the moment, which is, the bottom line of it is either the Iranians are tremendously stupid and incompetent, or they are in fact not in that much of a hurry to go for a nuclear weapon. And I would argue that that is a fact that we shouldn't overlook. It provides us some leeway in the process that we don't normally think about. I personally think, and again, this is where I get into the sort of moderate confidence about what I'm talking about. I personally believe that Iran is actually not in the process of building a nuclear weapon. They are in the process of building a nuclear infrastructure, a capability that would give them breakout capability, so that if they wanted to, at some point in the future, go for a bomb, they would have the infrastructure that is there necessary to make that decision. That's, again, not something that I think we should be happy about, but I think that's where we're at. What you may not realize is that there are something like 40 countries in the world that have that capability. If they decided to go for a bomb, they've got the nuclear infrastructure already. We live with that every single day, and Iran is determined to join that club. My own guess is we're not going to be able to keep them out of that club, whether we want to or not. I'm not going to talk about it, but there are some fixes, things that one could do to satisfy some of Iran's needs while providing transparency and monitoring them carefully about what they do, which would give us a degree of confidence that we know what they're up to at any given point. There are some interesting ideas that are out there, and I'll be happy to talk about those if anybody wants to follow up. But my key point here is that the kind of policy that we have been pursuing, which is based on the premise that we can coerce Iran into not knowing anything about nuclear technology. Well, seriously, I mean, we don't want them to know how to enrich uranium. That's what we're saying. That's zero tolerance. We are not going to accept that. And we're going to bring pressure on them until they stop doing it. Well, we've been at this policy now for quite a while. And it's multiple administrations. It's not just the Bush administration. It was the Clinton administration before them. Had exactly the same ideas, and it hasn't worked. With all of our coercion and the sanctions that we have imposed on Iran, they now know a lot more about enriching uranium than they did when we started. And they're not stopping. And the chance that we can bring additional coercive pressure on them is fairly unlikely. And again, if you'd like to discuss the sanctions and the way those work, I could talk about those. But let me turn to another subject, which is one of lower confidence, and we know what we're talking about. And that is Iranian internal politics and where that stands, because this is one of the great mysteries. When Mr. Ahmadinejad came to New York, you may have heard that he was in New York in September. I had the real, at least the interesting experience of spending about 5 hours in the same room with him. First of all, he spoke at Columbia University. I think some of you may have heard about that. Our president made some rather strong remarks. I was in the front row, and I was watching Ahmadinejad and the way he responded to the whole thing. And then the next evening, he held a meeting at his hotel, which he does every year when he comes. This is his second visit. He had a meeting where he had about 40 people from think tanks, academics that work on Iran, and people who were involved in the media in particular. Very big media poobah types, Brian Williams, Christiana Amanpour, people like that. And so we had this room full of this interesting group of people, of which I was fortunate to be one. And I won't go through the whole detail of the thing, but he ended up spending 3 hours with us. And the first half of that time was spent taking comments. He asked for comments rather than questions. So everybody asked a question in the form of a comment. And we took it ad seriatim, just one after another. I think we had a total of something like 28 comments. And he didn't respond. He just listened. And then at the end of that period, he then responded, basically, apparently, on the basis of his own notes. This was all simultaneous translation. He responded by going through every one of those comments in order. He got the names right, he got the questions right. His answers were certainly not acceptable as far as I was concerned. In fact, but this was an interesting display for a variety of reasons. One is that he was listening, he was paying attention, and actually, that was a pretty impressive performance just on a technical basis. The guy is smart. This is no dummy. He managed to get it all straight, to get everything right, and to go through an hour and a half of responses, one after the other. As I say, the other thing is, however, that his responses were not very good. Not very good in the sense that this is not a man who responds in a very thoughtful way. You ask him a question and he says, "That's really interesting. Let's think about this and let's have a dialogue about that." That's not his style at all. His style is to say, you ask him a question or offer a comment, and he comes back with a snappy reply that puts you in your place and shows that he's the smartest guy in the room and that you should be, that you're wrong, that he knows more about it than you do. I know that Ed Martin has had some experience with him in other contexts, particularly with meeting with religious groups, and he seems to be more open to discussion when he's talking to religious groups than he does in talking to people of the sort that I mentioned. Another basic fact, I think, that we tend to overlook with Ahmadinejad is that this guy with his bad suits and his cheap shoes and his sort of feisty approach to things is not really talking to you or to me. He's really addressing a third world audience. And I think Shibley's notice in his poll shows that he's succeeding in reaching that. And I think that's something we have to take very much, take into account. He has his anti-Israeli part, which is the part that bothers us the most, I think, is based on a couple of things. First of all, this is a guy, the president of Iran doesn't have a lot of power. Traditionally, it's the supreme leader who has the number of the leading power. He's the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He has runs all of these different groups. That is something that has been true all along. Ahmadinejad is in fact trying to change that. He is trying to acquire more power into the presidency. And he's having a rather considerable success in doing it. Part of his reason is the Israel issue, that when he found that he couldn't do what he wanted to do on the domestic side, on the economic side, and other areas, he picked an issue that nobody could argue with him about, because this is dogma as far as Iran is concerned. And they haven't paid that much attention to it, but it was an issue that he could hit hard, and it gave him a lot of notoriety, and he could be his feisty self and attract a lot of attention to himself, and in effect bypass the rest of the political establishment that wanted to hold him down and get him under control, who thought that they could. He is getting away from them, and he is showing increasing ability to take the matters into his own hands. And I would say that his recent situation where he fired Ali Larijani, who was the chief negotiator for Iran and the secretary of their National Security Council and the personal representative of the supreme leader, he just fired him and replaced him with his own guy in the middle of negotiations, and clearly without having cleared it with anybody, and he got away with it. So one of the things, the questions that this raises is who's really in charge here? And I think we do need to keep in mind very much that that who is in charge in Iran is always a matter of doubt. That it is a shifting set of coalitions that go from one side to the other, and Ahmadinejad is trying to shift that in his own favor. That said, he is running for president again for a second term, which is permissible in Iran's politics. He's only been there for 3 years. He's running for president in 2009, the spring and summer of 2009. And about 6 months ago, if you had asked most people in Iran, the sort of usual suspects, the people who really watch politics very closely and are personally involved in it, they would have said that he didn't have a chance. The economic reforms that he was supposed to be making had worked. Inflation was out of control, unemployment was out of control, and that these issues that he had taken on had actually made Iran look worse in the eyes of the international community, and that he was going to be held responsible for that. I'm not so sure. His strategy in Iran is not that different from his strategy in the third world, and that is to try sort of a retail politics directly to the people outside the center. He has offended everybody in Tehran. That is simply a fact, and that's where most politics gets done in Iran. His politics is aimed out of the provinces, at the small towns, the rural areas, and so forth. And that area, it remains to be seen how they will vote in this coming election. But if he succeeds in winning a re-election against the whole establishment, it's going to be an earthquake in Iranian politics. It's going to be something altogether new. And one of the things that none of us can really understand at all at this point is what the relationship is between Ahmadinejad, the feisty president with great power ambitions, and the supreme leader, Khamenei, who seems to be letting him get away with it. And if you know of anybody who has an answer to that question, please contact me. This is something that I'm spending a lot of time thinking about, and I just don't have an answer to it at this point. Let me close with a couple of thoughts about sort of what do we do now? Where do we go from here? And I'm not going to try to outline a whole peace plan or anything of the sort, but I do think that there are certain things that we can make. And Shibley made the first of the points, and that is that basically you really do have to talk to your enemies. Palestinians, that you simply are never going to make any progress if you don't. And Iran has been put in the same category as Hamas. In fact, Iran's policy toward the Arab-Israel dispute is very much like Hamas's policy. Reading what Jimmy Carter had to say, I didn't hear him, but I heard a report of his, he was on NPR this morning and was interviewed. And there were two catches in the Hamas position, that Hamas was prepared to accept a Palestinian vote. They were prepared to accept an outcome if it was supported by the Palestinian people. Iran says exactly the same thing. The catch is they want all Palestinians in the world to vote. And that's going to cause a problem. Now, that is not going to be an easy way out of this process. The second thing is about Israel, the acceptance of Israel, the acceptance of a two-state solution. Yes, that is a possible outcome, but they also make it very clear that they don't believe in that at all, and they don't necessarily accept the legitimacy of Israel as a state. Despite you, I think I did stay in time. I am going to stop, and I think the interesting part of this, however, is sort of what you have to say and where we go from here. And I hope that between the two of us, we've offered enough questions to give you something to think about at least. Thank you very much.
Gary and Shibley, thank you very much. We have indeed some time for some questions. I will use my prerogative to ask the first question of Gary. Gary, Syria has had a long-term relationship with Iran, going back a number of years. Iran is a supporter of Hezbollah in both Syria and Lebanon. It's a supporter of Hamas. How important do you think Syrian support is for these organizations, and how big a factor are they in the conflict?
Well, I'm sure Shibley has something to say on that also. The relationship between Iran and Syria is not just a marriage of convenience that they happen to agree on particular issues. This goes back very far to family background and historically Shia involvement in Syria. It also is a fact that Hezbollah works, Syria believes that Hezbollah works to its benefit and Iran sees it as working to its benefit. If Syria decided not to cooperate with Iran in support of Hezbollah, Iran would find it almost impossible to go on with that. So the idea that you might be able to flip Syria and get them to go against Iran is a very attractive idea. Nobody has succeeded in doing it thus far. And the Syrians seem to think that they have more to gain. If there were a solution, however, to the Lebanese standoff, and or if there was some serious progress on the Arab-Israel dispute, it's very possible that the differences between Iran and Syria would begin to emerge in a more effective way than they have in the past. And I think that is something that is worth thinking about. Not again by whether you can force them by the point of the gun to separate, but whether in fact you can in fact carry it along with their differing interests, because their interests are not the same in Lebanon. That you can bring out those different views. And one final point, and it's true also with Iran's policy in Iraq. Iran has influence with Iraq, but also in Syria and with Hezbollah. They do not have control. They do not issue orders that tell them what to do. They consult with them. And Nasrallah the other day when he was talking said, the Iranians listen to us more than we listen to them. And there may be some truth to that.
I want to say something about this. I think that, first I agree with Gary, that the notion of flipping Syria is wrong. And I think part of the idea that engaging Syria is intended essentially for broadening the coalition of confrontation with Iran is something that cannot work. And that's why I think, particularly now, as we're talking about what the next president's agenda should be, I think there is a linkage between all of these issues. Iraq, Iran, the Arab-Israeli issue, Syria. If we're thinking in the same mindset of our current policy, that this is what we're doing, but let's just try to get another ally for this or another ally for this, it's just simply going to fall. It's going to fail. It's not going to happen. Every single thing that we have to do is going to have to be in the context of a broader and a different approach regionally. And it means that even, if you ask me what is the priority of the next president of the United States, no matter what other issues they might want to put on the table, it's obvious that the first priority will still be Iraq. And maybe the second priority will be the economy, or maybe the two of them together. But the Iraq issue, even for a president who wants to pull out from Iraq very quickly, is going to take, maybe the whole first administration of disengaging from Iraq. You cannot succeed in that unless you have a different approach to the entire region, whether it's to Syria or to Iraq, because the consequences are immense. So for Syria, if you want to engage them on the Israeli-Syrian front, you cannot think of it simply as a tactical move to isolate Iran. And that can only work, I think, if it is done in the context of a new policy that includes engaging Iran. And if it isn't, I don't think the Syrians are going to budge. There is, however, something interesting going on now, which is that the Israelis and the Syrians are talking behind the scenes. And there's statements this week from both the Israelis and the Syrians suggesting that they're prepared to engage. And as if the Palestinian-Israeli track collapses in the short term, as it could, I think the prospects that we can have a real agreement before this administration leaves remain very small. And I think the focus is going to be more on the Syrian-Israeli front, but this would require really a different mindset about how we should deal with the entire regional basket of issues.
Thank you. This is a related question for either one of you. What are Iran's real interests in Gaza? Why is Iran focusing on Gaza? How and why can Iran be so ideologically flexible vis-a-vis a Sunni Arab resistance?
I don't think there's any contradiction at all. I mean, if in fact Iran is taking a position of being the sort of world leader against Israel, that's its agenda, and that's the policy that they're promoting, and that's how they feel that they're winning support in the third world, then identifying Gaza as a starting point for that policy and supporting Hamas is a perfectly rational way to go about doing your policy. And that doesn't mean we have to necessarily like it anymore than we like a lot of the policies that Hamas carries out. But the fact that they're doing it. And again, it does, I think, underscore the fact that this whole business about a Sunni-Shia divide is overstated. It doesn't mean that it's not true or that there aren't underlying elements of it, but it's not the dominant prism through which everybody is looking at their politics in the region. And so for Iran to cooperate with a basically Sunni group is not at all.
Actually, the bigger puzzle really is not why Iran would do it. I think Gary's absolutely right. It's perfectly rational for them to do it. The bigger puzzle is why would Hamas do it. And that's particularly because Hamas remains dependent on Arab governments particularly, and whatever the Arab public says, you can see the Arab public is less worried about Iran. But Arab governments are worried about Iran, and even President Mahmoud Abbas sort of highlights, the Iranian link to Hamas. When you go talk to King Abdullah II of Jordan, he will say, Hamas is bringing Iran to the Arab Israeli agreement. you find all that kind of discourse, and so why would they do it? Actually, Iran is not the favorite address. They go there by default, only because when they become desperate. The Saudis understood that. One reason why the Saudis tried to mediate between Hamas and Fatah was actually to prevent Hamas from going to Iran, because they worried about expansion. But we helped them basically by taking the Arabs in the option and turning Iran turning Hamas toward Iran more aggressively.
Here again is a question with a video overlap. Do you believe, this is the origins of terrorism and the support for terrorism, do you believe that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the chief motive for recruiting al-Qaeda terrorists?
Well, speaking for myself, and looking at it in terms of Iran's take on things, I think that the Al-Qaeda and company have actually come to use the Arab-Israel issue, and I'm not at all sure that that was where it started from. You can't, if you look at the foreign fighters pouring into, initially into Afghanistan many years ago, but we assisted in the process. Another piece of our policy that backfired on us, and I was in the White House when those policies were started, actually. If you look at that in Afghanistan, but then you look at the entry of particularly Saudis and others into Iraq, I don't think they're coming to Iraq to blow themselves up and fight because they think they're fighting for the Arab-Israel cause. I think they're going there to confront what they see as imperialism and the takeover by another country of an Arab state. And they may be badly misguided in the way they think about that, but I don't see the Arab-Israel issue as the center of their decision-making process. And maybe I'm wrong about that, and I don't know, maybe you've got some data on that.
Yeah, I actually have some disagreement with Gary on this, and it's a little bit more so. I mean, first of all, I do have data on it, and we ask people, what aspect of Al-Qaeda do you sympathize with most, if any? And obviously, a large number don't sympathize with any aspect of Al-Qaeda, but the plurality say that they sympathize primarily with the fact they're standing up to the U.S., and secondarily, almost the equal number, because they're speaking for causes like the Palestinian question. Only about 7% say they support them because they embrace their actual Islamic agenda. So the majority of people who express sympathy with them, and that doesn't mean necessarily people who are going to join them. I mean, you have to be clear on that. This is kind of an expression of sympathy, but you can expect that a similar trend is happening even among those who are actually mobilized to support them. But I want to say something on this because we have a kind of a simplistic approach to what is Al-Qaeda. There is one which is what do Al-Qaeda leaders want. On that I agree with Gary. I don't think it's primarily the Arabs. I think what motivates bin Laden is something different. He does believe in the Islamic agenda. I think he's a real believer. This is a guy who wants to turn the Middle East into an Islamic state. And if there was any issue that mobilized him initially was the American presence on Saudi soil, and we see actually support for that, particularly in the Arabian Peninsula. So that's clear. But the question isn't what motivates him. The question is why people join him. That's the question. And I think there's a demand side to terrorism just like there's a supply side to terrorism. And people don't join necessarily for the same reasons as the entrepreneurs organize. They join for different reasons. And when we say they go to Iraq because they're confronting America, absolutely, they're not thinking immediately Palestine. But you have to think about what it is that makes them hate America, or what it is that makes them hate the American presence, or what it is that makes them hate particular action. So when you ask them of the following steps, and we give them 7 steps to define their views toward the U.S., what identifies, what would improve your views toward the United States more than anything else? The number one issue is brokering Arab Israeli peace based on the 67 border. And the number 2 issue is pulling out of Iraq and the Arabian Peninsula. Those are the 2 issues, obviously, that defines the attitude toward the U.S. And that's what's exploited, because there's, so when when we say it's not the Palestine issue is the prototype of the anti-imperialism you're talking about. It is the prototype of their collective sense of humiliation. It is the prototype of the basis of the resentment toward American foreign policy. So in that sense, it's huge, particularly as they're observing, it's an ongoing conflict. So they're observing all of the things that are happening in Gaza and elsewhere. And so when I'm out there in Saudi Arabia, as I was just a few weeks ago, while I was in Marshall, I was doing the fall, I was there for a week. And people are fascinated with our elections, and they're focused on Iran, they're focused on Hillary and McCain, and they want to know more about it. And I ended up spending more time on it than I knew I would need to. But the first question they asked me is McCain going to pull out of Iraq? Is Obama going to confront Iran? Is Hillary pro-human rights? Is McCain going to push for democracy? Everywhere I went, at every level, including, by the way, in the Shia section of Iran. I went to in the Tehran area. I went out there and I met with Shia dissidents at a forum, sort of salon. They have these intellectual salons. And the first question they want to know is, what is their position on the Arab-Israeli issue? That is the prism that defines their attitude. Am I going to like them or am I going to dislike them? It's a psychological attitude. It's not about the strategic shift. Of course, the Gulf is more important. And economically, it's more important. It's not just strategically, militarily, the American presence, but even economically, it's far more important. But there is this psychological prism. This is a prototype issue. It's an identity issue. It is the one that frames their attitudes toward the world. It is the one that frames their attitudes toward the U.S. The intensity of that matters a lot for the intensity of their feelings, for the intensity of their action. And that makes them far more easy recruits, some of them. I mean, it doesn't go from anger to recruitment, but therefore it is a factor in ways that are more important than otherwise are substantive.
There are 2 questions sort of about the big picture. What are the real strategic interests of the U.S. In the Middle East? And do you see any prospects for any redefinition of U.S. strategic interests in the Middle East in a new administration? And in that context, do you think the new administration is any more likely to change the existing policy or be more effective in seeking a 2-state solution?
What our strategic interests are, this is a place where everybody has these loud debates about oil. Is it all about oil, et cetera? And the short answer is, yeah, it is. Because especially, of course, I look at the Middle East starting from the Gulf, and Shibley looks at it starting from the Levant. But the reality is that in either case, the outcome is the reason why the Gulf area is important to us. It's not because we love those people so much and because they are so friendly and happy and because this is something that we have a moral interest in. We may have all of those things, but the bottom line is that there was no oil underneath that soil in the Gulf, our interest would be considerably less. I've always said, that if the Iranian Revolution had in fact happened in Bolivia, it wouldn't have been a very big deal. I mean, we would have managed to live with that quite easily, and it would not have affected us very much. The fact that we had basically constructed a whole strategic structure relying very much on the Shah and Iran, and when that fell, it left us absolutely at sea in the Gulf, was a matter of great significance. So yes, oil is very much part of it. The real question is not whether oil matters to us or to the rest of the world, because it obviously does. I mean, we just just look at the inflation numbers, and you look at the price of gasoline these days, and you look at the price of a barrel of oil, and it all has to do with conflict in the Gulf and in the region. And that has an impact on every single one of us, every single day, in everything that we do. And that's true not just here, but in the entire world. It is important, actually. The question is not whether it's important, it's how do you deal with that? And I can't answer the question of whether the next president is going to find a different way. But looking at the results that we've gotten in the last 17 years, where we were supposedly defending our fundamental interests, and particularly oil and the like, and you look at the outcome of that, at the end of 17 years of direct U.S. involvement and direct U.S. military intervention, and the price of oil has gone up at least 400%, and there is, and the stability in the region is not evident to anybody looking around. You have to ask whether that's the best way to do it. Do I think we should withdraw from the Gulf? No, I don't. Do I think we could lower our profile dramatically? Yes, I do. And I think that you could do a lot in coming up with an alternative strategy, one that we have not really tested. And that's what brings me back to this whole idea of we've taken it upon ourselves to coerce the countries of that region into doing what we want them to do. And it hasn't worked. It really, I think, is time to think about alternative ways of trying to get them to cooperate with us. And I think that has not really been tried since really going back before the Iranian Revolution. And it might not be a bad idea to try it again.
I think that there's some short-term strategic interest and long-term strategic interest. Obviously, oil is a core interest, but frankly, there isn't a lot much we can do about oil. I think all the patterns in the past indicate that it's primarily market-driven. The logic of supply and demand drives prices more than any other political issue. And this notion that A can be energy independent or that we clean ourselves from the Middle East oil is totally nonsensical. There's one oil market that all sits in the same cup. It doesn't matter whether we buy it from Venezuela or Russia or whether we buy it from the Middle East. It's all the same market and it's all the same price and we're going to pay the same price. So it really isn't an issue. The reality remains that with all the alternate energy that we're likely to put on the market, the demand is going to outstrip whatever new energy we're going to put on the market. And oil for the next 50 years is going to remain critically important to the international economy, with demand rising, particularly from the Asian continent and China. And we see that more than anything, having driven the price of oil, it was expected that somehow the Iraq War was going to put downward pressure on the oil prices. If you remember the debate prior to the Iraq War, in large part because Iraq was seen to have significant oil reserves on the tap. Clearly, it hasn't happened. But even if it did, most of the logic of the increase had nothing to do with the war, one way or the other. It had to do more with the increasing demand from Asia. And in that sense, the U.S. is competing, and the military isn't going to be too much of a factor in that. You see China particularly a big player in the Middle East oil market, and they're putting a lot of energy, particularly soft power. China, by the way, is when I ask a question, who among world leaders, who among the following countries would you rather be the sole superpower? France was always number one, but China is number two, and the U.S. is at the bottom. China, when you go to the Gulf and meet Chinese envoys, they often are fluent in Arabic. And unlike our envoys, or for that matter, our embassies, which have few people who can even speak Arabic. So China is competing at a soft power level in a way without having to put any forces there. The short-term impact of that isn't really in the oil as such, because as I said, I don't think we can do anything about the oil. I think it's in the financial markets. One of the things that we haven't paid attention to is that this increase in oil prices that is likely to continue has resulted in the accumulation of a lot of cash by the GCC states, the Gulf Cooperation Council states, anchored around Saudi Arabia, including Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. They are a huge player in the world financial markets. and they are one of the largest creditors to the United States of America now. And they account for up to 2/3 of the so-called sovereign funds that have been established, and they are increasingly affecting and influencing the intellectual financial markets in ways that American farmers is going to have to deal with. No matter what you think about these issues, I don't, from the immediate point of view of any American president, as I said, I think the first priority strategic issue will be what do you do about Iraq. And then there will be a lot of issues that are going to be competing for the priority of the next president that could get a placement on the list of priorities. I think we're going to have a national debate because I don't think these strategic interests are predetermined objectively except for a few. So that it matters in our debate what you place on that strategic list. Is it going to be stopping Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons? Is it going to be resolving the Arab-Israeli dispute? Is it going to be the global warming issue? And I don't think these things are predetermined. I don't think you can say objectively that one of these should be ranked higher on the strategic priorities of the United States of America. I think they're debatable. And that's why I think what you're doing is extremely important. Because I think there are some choices to be made for the next president to put things on the agenda. I happen to think that the immediate priority should be resolving the Arab-Israeli dispute, because I think if we don't have it, we're going to face a period of continuous upheaval in the region that are going to continue to place the U.S. in a difficult position. Not only strategic choices are going to be difficult, but moral choices are going to be difficult. There will be increasingly difficult moral choices to be made if the two-state solution collapses. And I think that it may be the last chance in the next administration for anyone to preserve the two-state solution option. And if we don't do it, I think we're in trouble. And to my mind, that issue should be placed very high on the American strategic priorities.
Shibley, are you optimistic or pessimistic on that last point?
I don't answer that because I'm a realist. And I think that I'm not a determinist. I'm a realist, but not a determinist. And if you ask me to bet my money that we're going to have a solution, I wouldn't put my money on it. But I can tell you that all the breakthroughs in history happened when most of us political scientists didn't predict them. Right. And so I'll leave it at that.
Can I add just one word?
Please, Eric.
On the business, I think I disagree a little bit with Shibley. Not that supply and demand is important, it obviously is. The price of oil today has very little to do with supply and demand. It has to do with oil futures that are being purchased in many cases to protect people on the financial side, and it also has to do with what is called generally a sort of violence premium, that basically you build in an extra, and in many cases today it's like $30 or more to the price of a barrel of oil, is in fact a premium that is paid for violence and the dangers of violence in the future. And that's why it's being so volatile. Now, the long-term trend is absolutely true. The supply and demand will keep the price of oil up. It won't necessarily keep it over $100. It could very well settle at, say, $70 or something like that, which today looks pretty good. It looked terrible a few years ago. But that's something else. The other thing that I think you really need to think about in terms of just the cost of these things is that if you look at what we're putting in, $1 billion a week or something like that into Iraq and Afghanistan, that is also a tax that you are paying for oil. Basically, if our purpose in being there is to provide for stability and to keep the oil flowing freely in that region, and that's certainly one of the reasons for our being there, we're paying an extremely high price for that, and that really should be factored in to the price of a barrel of oil. And it's something that I think American consumers have not really thought about at all, whether they're interested in paying that tax.
Thank you both very much. That concludes our morning plenary session. The workshops will begin in the various locations which you can find on your program in about 10 or 15 minutes. Thank you very much. You, coming in here, you saw two posters that were one is 3 leaders talking in Annapolis last November. You can tell it's the fall because there's a nice leaf in the background. And the other is a map. The map comes from the Geneva Initiative, what was agreed by non-government representatives, but people who are skilled, experienced negotiators. A few years ago in Geneva, of what a 2-state solution would look like. We don't know whether anything will come out or what it will look like, but if anything does come out, if we are going to have some kind of solution, our 2-state solution that we're looking for is probably going to look something like that. So we have a process going on at the moment. It started in Annapolis in the beginning, and our goal is the 2-state solution. And we are here in Washington to do whatever we can to get from point A to point B. There are, we all do witness, I think. We're all doing Christian witness. Others do mission. They're out in the field. They're doing good work. We work here. Our task is policy. Our task is to try to influence the U.S. government stand and its actions in promoting the peace process in this terrible conflict. At best, at the end of this year, there may be some kind of an agreement, but that agreement will need to be implemented. That'll be a difficult process. So there's an important need not only for getting the process going this year, but for continuity and continuing the follow-through into the near future. So there will be vigilance required by all of us, participation. We're going to have to get our hands dirty and our feet wet to maybe mix my metaphors a little bit. But it's a task that we're looking forward to eagerly. To open this morning, we have 2 very distinguished speakers who will tell us about some of the difficulties and some of the complications along our path. Telhami, is a very distinguished Anwar Sadat professor at the University of Maryland. You can read his biography that's been passed out. He's a senior fellow at the Sabine Center at the Brookings Institution. Gary Sick is a very old friend of mine I mentioned last night, starting my interest in the Middle East in the Navy. That was when I was with Gary in the Navy. We were in the Navy together in Morocco. So without further ado, I will turn the podium over to the speakers. I hope we can have a lively discussion this morning. These are 2 very distinguished, very knowledgeable people, and I hope that in our 90 minutes that we can continue on in this period with a lively discussion. So I'll turn it over to Shibley.
I'm sorry, let me just make one procedural item. Our process is if you have questions for the speakers, for you to write them on cards. So hopefully you have some, and we'll also be available on the side if you need one to write questions. And when you have one, lift it up and we'll collect it and bring it to the front.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's a pleasure for me to be here and an honor to serve on the board of this group, and I think your work is immensely needed in the pursuit of peace in the Middle East. What I'd like to do today is reflect on where we are, particularly on the peace process, but putting it in the context of my findings this week. I just released my annual Arab Public Opinion poll that I conduct every year in 6 Arab countries, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Morocco, Lebanon, and the United Arab Emirates. And there's some fascinating results. You could find those, by the way, on our website Sadat, sadat.umd.edu, and we just posted them on the website, and you're welcome to go look at it. But I want to put it in the context of the Annapolis conference. I know in the description of this event, there was mention of where we are on the Annapolis conference. If you look back last November and see why the Annapolis conference was held to begin with, particularly an administration which for the first 7 years really did very little trying to advance Arab-Israeli peace. It did not believe this is a priority issue. And if you look at it through the prism of the immediate crisis that they faced, it came out immediately after Hamas took over Gaza. And there was a split between Hamas and Fatah, and a territorial split for that matter. And if you backtrack a little bit and see where administration policy was and how it led to the Annapolis conference and how to interpret it and where it has moved since, it would be very interesting. First, the administration initially supported free elections in the Palestinian areas, which was a good thing. It wasn't, by the way, the first free elections because of the Palestinian areas. There were actually free elections back in the 1990s when the Oslo Accords were in the process, and as you know, that's the time when Yasser Arafat was elected the president of the Palestinian Authority, and Fatah did reasonably well. But this was a truly free election, and it was observed by international observers. Among them, Jimmy Carter, who's in the news this week for meeting with Hamas officials. He's again in the news this morning for being back in Israel, mediating between Hamas and Israel on the release of the on an exchange of prisoners. It seemed to have been a very free election that ultimately led to a shocking result for the administration, which was that Hamas won the parliamentary election and was then in a position to form its own government. And actually, the Palestinian public said maybe it's a good thing. In fact, even the moderate secular elites, if you talk to them immediately after, as I did, reported on what they were saying. Well, let's try it. Maybe it'll work. Fatah needed reform. Let's give them a try. And even President Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, thought maybe this is not a bad opportunity. Let them have a government. I'll negotiate, and then we'll come back to them to approve it. Well, we opposed that policy, and we did not want to deal with Hamas. We imposed sanctions on that government, and in the end, it led to a lot of friction between Hamas and Fatah that resulted in an outbreak of violence. That outbreak of violence ultimately led to Arab intervention, particularly Saudi intervention, in trying to mediate and create a national unity government. And it succeeded, and to everyone's surprise, actually, the Saudis succeeded in mediating a government. But our position still was, we will not deal with a government that has Hamas in it. And as a consequence, there was a stalemate, and particularly for Abu Mazen. Instead, our policy in Gaza was to try to help Fatah strengthen it, give it weapons, support it politically and militarily and economically, and put it in a position to take on Hamas, to take them on militarily, to defeat them, to get them out, to have Fatah come back into power. And Hamas, of course, knew that was going on, and they acted preemptively, and in fact took over Gaza. And then we were shocked again that our policy backfired, and we were in a position where Hamas was strengthened in Gaza. It took control. Fatah looked very weak, and even intelligence services, Israeli intelligence services, Jordanian intelligence services were reporting that Hamas may be even stronger than Fatah in the West Bank at the grassroots level. And so it was in that environment of failure, that there was this proposal to have the Annapolis conference. And the notion behind the Annapolis conference was this, separate from the politics, and I think there was a political reason for it, in part to changed the discourse about policy failure to an optimistic discourse of negotiations. But the basic notion was, now that Hamas isn't part of the government led by President Mahmoud Abbas in the West Bank, we can actually negotiate, the Israelis and the Palestinians could actually negotiate without Hamas. And Annapolis was intended, quote, to show that militancy doesn't pay and that moderation pays. So the notion behind it was, you make life difficult for the Palestinians in Gaza, you show that the militancy of Hamas doesn't work, and then you make progress on the West Bank, and you reward the moderates, and you get support for them from the regional players, including Arab governments. And then what you're going to have in the end is public opinion in the region will see that militancy doesn't pay and moderation pays. You will get support for the peace process. And in all of this, there was this sense that aside from the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, there was a regional context in which the players were operating, where it was said that the Arabs are primarily worried about the rise of the Iranian power, as are the Israelis. And somehow this kind of a new coalition of moderates in the region between Arabs and Israelis will help push this process forward and make it succeed. And obviously overlaid over this supposed fear of the rise of Iran is this Sunni-Shia divide that we see in fact is happening in some places like in Iraq and Lebanon. And it was said to be, again, a key issue driving regional politics in a way that would lead to different coalitions pushing the peace process forward. That was the theory. Now, where are we today? Well, let me tell you what could be Jimmy Carter's biggest argument in talking to Hamas. In the recent public opinion poll that was conducted in March that I did with Zappia International, over 4,000 participants in those 6 countries. There's no question that if you evaluate this poll on every score on this issue, you would have to say that our policy failed badly so far. Failed badly so far. Let me start with some of the results. Let me start with the background results. The Iran issue. There is a presupposition that the Iran issue is out there behind the minds of people in the region, seeing Iran as a bigger threat that trumps, that therefore provides a prism through which they might be able to make some moves on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Everything I have in this poll indicates that neither Iran nor the Shia-Sunni divide are the prism through which Arabs are looking at the world or are looking at American foreign policy. And that the defining prism among the Arab public opinion is still the Arab-Israeli issue, particularly the Palestinian issue. Let me give you some examples of this. First, every year I have a question. Whom among world leaders do you admire most? It's a question, an open question. They can name anyone they want in the world. This year, the number one answer by far is Hassan Nasrallah of Hezbollah, the head of Hezbollah. In the mostly Sunni Arab world, because I'm pulling in countries with Sunni majorities, with the exception of Lebanon. But certainly that's true in Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Egypt, Jordan, even the United Arab Emirates. So you have a Shia leader engaged in a sectarian struggle in the past year in Lebanon. It is a sectarian struggle, and you see it actually. One cannot say there's no sectarianism in Lebanon and Iraq. There is, of course there is, and it's important. It affects politics. But the point is that is not the key issue that is driving public attitudes on the broader issues. That's not the key prism through which they're making evaluations. It is up to a point within Lebanon and Iraq, but outside of the rest of the Arab world, that is not the key issue. In fact, of the top 3 leaders who are most popular in the Arab world, not a single one is a Sunni Arab leader. Not a single one. The second most important, a surprise, the president of Syria that we're trying to isolate. Bashar Assad, for the first time, emerges as a popular leader. I haven't seen that in many years. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad of Iran appears in number 3. So in some ways, if you consider the Alawis in Syria derivatives of Shia Islam, you could say that 3 of them are on the other side of the issue from the government, certainly, in the Arab world. Similarly, when you ask them with whom they sympathize most in the Lebanese internal struggle, more people sympathize with the opposition led by Hezbollah than with the government led by the Sunni prime minister that is supported by the Arab governments. So there's no question that the Sunni-Shia divide isn't the prism through which they're defining their attitudes toward the issues. Second, on Iran, I asked an open question which says, name the 2 countries that are most threatening to you. Period. That's an open question. Over 90% name Israel. Over 80% name the United States as one of the 2 biggest threats to them. 7% name Iran. 7% name Iran. And the shocker is that even in places like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, 2 countries whose governments are really worried about Iran, and they have strategic reasons to worry about Iran, legitimate ones, to worry about the rising Iranian power. Only a minority of the public is worried in the same way about Iran. By the way, that doesn't mean that they don't see Iran as a threat, because this is a relative term. If I were to ask them the question, is Iran a threat, you would get a larger number. It is that they see Iran as a considerably lesser threat than the United States and Israel. Imagine when you have our president going out to the United Arab Emirates and says, I, the President of the United States, whom the public sees as one of prime threat, say to you it's Iran that you have to worry about. And it just doesn't work, and it's clearly not working. On the question of Iran's nuclear power, by and large, it's interesting actually, a minority now believe that Iran is conducting its nuclear program in order to develop nuclear weapons. That's actually a drop from last year. Last year we had a slight majority thinking that Iran is trying to develop nuclear weapons, and I think the NIU report actually had an impact on their assessment. But the interesting thing is 2/3, and that was comparable to last year, 2/3 of the Arab public think that Iran has a right to its nuclear program, and that the international community should not stop them from having their nuclear program. They see that, they look at Iran's nuclear power program through the prism of confrontation with the US and Israel. They're not looking at it through an Iranian Arab prism. And that's the thing that that's the only way to interpret this result. If you ask them, do you believe if Iran were to acquire a nuclear weapon, would the outcome for the region be better or worse, more positive or more negative? A plurality say it's more positive for the region. And again, the only way to interpret that is they see that in the context of confrontation with the US and confrontation with Israel. That's the way they're framing their priority. They're not looking at it through the Iranian-Arab division, which exists. I mean, it's not that there isn't, I mean, don't get me wrong, but that's not the defining prism of their views. What about directly on the Arab-Israeli front and the Palestinian-Israeli front? Well, one question I ask is, in the Palestinian political competition between Fatah and Hamas, with whom do you sympathize most? And a plurality says with both to some extent, but with those who sympathize with one over the other, by a ratio more than 2 to 1, they sympathize with Hamas more than they sympathize with Fatah and President Mahmoud Abbas. Even worse, when you ask them who's responsible for Gaza among Palestinians outside of Israel and the U.S., which they will blame for that, more people blame the government of President Mahmoud Abbas than Hamas for the trouble in Gaza. So if you want to say, is our policy working on this issue? Are the moderates being rewarded? Are the militants being punished in public opinion? Are people saying militancy doesn't pay? Well, I think that's not what's going on. And clearly, it's exactly the opposite of what was intended in policy. The policy clearly not working, at least in the Arab world. And by the way, among Palestinians, the trend has been very similar recently. In the most recent poll by Khalid Shafaqi in the West Bank and Gaza, where Hamas is gaining, and even if elections were held today, Hamas's prime minister has a good chance of being elected president against President Mahmoud Abbas. So it's a bleak picture in terms of what has been attained. What about in terms of the acceptability of a two-state solution? We have been asking questions on this issue for the past couple of years, which is, which of the following statements do you agree with most? A, I'm prepared for peace based on two states along the 1967 borders, and I believe that Arab governments should do more. B, I'm prepared for peace based on the 67 borders, but I don't think the Israelis would ever accept it. And C, I'm not prepared for peace with Israel under any circumstances. The good news this year is only 19% in those countries that say, I'm not prepared for peace under any circumstances. And in fact, the vast majority, over 70%, say that they're in principle open to the idea of a two-state solution. But here's the bad news. The bad news is the majority, in fact, the vast majority of those who support a two-state solution don't think it will ever happen. And when you ask people, in fact, directly, what do you think are the prospects of Arab-Israeli peace, 55% say it will never happen. And only about, I believe, 15% or so believe that it's likely to happen in the next 5 years. So what you have here is, in principle, an openness to a two-state solution based on the 67 border, but total pessimism about its prospects. And that, by the way, is the dynamic that we see among Israelis and Palestinians as well, and that is the dynamic that leads to people having, being in principle pro-peace, but supporting militancy because they don't believe the other side is going to accept it. And so you have militancy at the same time. You could be pro-peace and elect Hamas, and you could be an Israeli pro-peace and elect somebody like Ariel Sharon. And that is something that comes from this kind of dynamic that is clearly very powerful, very strong at this time. Where does that leave us? Well, let me just make first two concluding notes. One is on President Jimmy Carter's visit, and two, on where we are on the two-state solution question. President Jimmy Carter, as you know, has been criticized for going out and talking to Hamas. And I think lost in this picture is context, which is unfortunately missed. Number one, that Jimmy Carter is not a rogue former president going out there to go against American foreign policy or even meet with groups that are anti-American, but rather is part of this very impressive international group of elders, elder statesmen, primarily Nobel laureates that includes Nelson Mandela, Kofi Annan, Muhammad Yunus, President Cardoso of Brazil, Mary Robinson. Those who are trying to engage regional conflict and address it and resolve it and bring in the moral weight collectively to help resolve some of the regional conflict. And no one criticized him when he was out there highlighting the Darfur tragedy in recent months. He was out there doing hard work. He was obviously criticized in the region for what he was doing, but wasn't criticized here at all. But we don't have this context. Second, it is clear that policy isn't working. I mean, you can say, I want to isolate Hamas, but what do we have here? What we have here is, number one, policy isn't working, but there is another side of this that we're ignoring. It's not just that policy isn't working, it's getting the exact opposite consequences. We have a horrific humanitarian crisis on our hand. I mean, we sort of like dismiss that. We forget what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank. And yes, in Israel too. I mean, the missiles, the rockets against Europe. But in Gaza, it is a true human tragedy. And this is a population of 1.5 million. This is the 60th anniversary of the creation of Israel and the creation of the Palestinians call it the Nakba, the creation of the Palestine refugee problem. And Gaza, the vast majority of people in Gaza are refugees. There were no, most of the citizens of Gaza, people who were refugees, who actually came from what is now central Israel on Gaza, did not know nothing. They've never known independence of any kind. The vast majority of people have never had anything but uncomfortable, horrible conditions. And they are more horrible today than they were 10 years ago, and more horrible today than they were 20 years ago. And it is just sad and tragic, and somebody has to do something about it just for that. But Jimmy Carter today has something interesting to report, which is he's back in Israel after having met with Hamas leaders, to say that in his comments today in the Israeli press was that he is delivering not only a proposal for exchange of prisoners, but he is delivering a message that Hamas is prepared to accept Israel, that Israel has a right to live in peace within 67 borders, and that if Abu Mazen negotiates a deal, and that deal is put forth before the Palestinians for a vote, and the Palestinians vote for it, that Hamas will abide by it. And the condition, I think, that he seems to put, that they seem to put forth is that there would be a national unity government, and which I think that, personally, I think it's impossible to move forward while the policy is to destroy Hamas, given who they are. I think it is best to find a way to communicate with them. Communicating with a party is not embracing it. That is a silly argument. We've talked to Stalin, we've talked to Mao. The notion that talking to someone means embracing them is ridiculous. Otherwise, we'd never have negotiations with enemies. And I'm afraid that if I look at it from the point of view of where we are on the Arab-Israeli conflict, particularly the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, I think we're reaching the end of the road on the two-state solution. I believe the next president of the United States will be the last president to deal with the two-state solution. And I'm saying that not only because of the changing reality on the ground. I'm talking about the settlements and the roads and the reconfiguration of the West Bank and the increasingly challenging road ahead if one's going to have a viable Palestinian state side by side with Israel. But I also am thinking about where the elites are. And I think what I see is, for the first time, really since the early 90s, and maybe even I would say since the 80s. In the 80s, I think there was a transition of accepting a two-state solution in the Palestine national movement in particular, and among Israelis as well, particularly after the first Intifada in '87. I am now seeing an advance